Some people believe that by screaming louder, threatening harder, and creating fear, they will always stay on top. But what they forget is that the most dangerous people aren't the ones who scream. They're the ones who remember. And when they take revenge, the wounds don't show on the outside. They hit deep inside. My name is Lauren Morgans, and this is my story. When my husband and I got married, we were going through a phase of life where every decision was made out of necessity, not choice. Money was tight, responsibilities were heavy, and because of that, we had to live with my in-laws for a while. At first, it felt temporary, like something we just had to endure until things got better. I had no idea that this house wouldn't just be a place to stay, it would become a test. The hardest part of that house was my father-in-law. A man who carried his failures on his shoulders and dropped them onto everyone else. Manipulative, a liar, controlled by his anger. He was mentally unwell, but instead of seeking treatment, he used his condition as an excuse to hurt people. He knew exactly what he was doing. He knew his behavior made everyone miserable, and yet he never stopped. I never had a personal grudge against him. I didn't want conflict. I just wanted distance. I kept to myself. I did my part. I stayed quiet and counted the days. My mother-in-law, on the other hand, was completely different. Years of emotional exhaustion had worn her down, but she wasn't a bad person. She had spent her entire life with a man who never allowed her a voice. When I entered that house, she felt like she finally had someone on her side. I cleaned without being asked. I cooked. I helped around the house because I was raised to believe that when you live in someone else's home, you don't just take space, you take responsibility. But for my father-in-law, nothing I did was ever enough. To him, I was just an easy target. A new girl. Quiet. Alone whenever everyone else was out. 3 times, he unloaded his anger on me. 3 times, he blamed me for things I never did. And every single time, he made sure we were alone. Each time I stayed silent. Each time, I told myself it was just his mood. Each time, I convinced myself that ignoring it would make it stop. But for people like him, silence isn't peace. It's permission. Then came that morning. Not just an argument. A turning point. The moment he saw me, he started yelling, accusing, blaming me for mistakes that weren't mine. His anger was meant for someone else, but the attack was aimed at me because I was smaller, because I was a woman, and because I was alone. My hands were shaking. My breathing was uneven. And my mind was dragged back to the house I grew up in, where shouting was normal and fear was routine. This time, something inside me snapped. I didn't stay quiet. I answered back. I raised my voice. And for the first time, I saw surprise in his eyes. Like he never expected the girl he thought was weak to speak at all. That's when I realized something important. He wasn't powerful. His power only existed because of other people's fear. But I also knew something else. Men like him become more dangerous when they feel control slipping away. I was scared for my safety, so I called my husband immediately. He came to get me so I wouldn't be alone in that house. When we returned later that evening, my father-in-law acted like nothing had happened. No apology. No shame. Just a strange silence. One that felt more like a challenge than peace. That night, I didn't sleep. I replayed every word, every scream, every look. And that's when I understood. This man couldn't be defeated by yelling. Not by respect. And definitely not by fear. The only way to break him was to take away the one thing he valued more than anything else. Control. Because when you slowly strip control from a man like that, quietly, patiently, he falls apart from the inside, without a single visible scar. That night, my silence changed. It was no longer fear. It became thought. It became strategy. And my father-in-law still had no idea that the woman he thought was weak was about to become the quietest and deepest revenge of his life. If you ever feel in a house that people are watching your silence more closely than your words, understand this. You are in the wrong place. And when staying in the wrong place becomes a necessity, people either break or they learn how to break others. After that incident, the atmosphere of the house completely changed. There were no fights, no shouting, but still, everything felt heavier than before, as if the walls had heard everything and now refused to speak. My father-in-law was no longer the same in the mornings. He would come into the kitchen, see me, and then leave without saying a word. Sometimes he would drag a chair loudly on purpose. Sometimes he would slam things down. But when I didn't react, his anger would freeze on his face, like he couldn't understand why I wasn't afraid anymore. And when abusive people fail to understand why the person in front of them isn't breaking, they become even more dangerous. But in this house, there wasn't just one danger. The real danger was quieter than that. My brother-in-law. He had always been silent, but now his silence was noticeable. Like he wasn't just watching. He was judging. He didn't smile when he saw me. He didn't look away. He just kept staring. Sometimes, when I was in the kitchen, he would come in pretending to get water. Sometimes when I walked through the corridor, he would already be standing there. Every time, he would only say, "Ahem." And I understood that this, was actually a question. My mother-in-law, caught between all of this, had become completely colorless. She always wanted to say something, but never could. Sometimes she looked at me, sometimes at her son, sometimes at her husband, and then stayed quiet. Her silence was the oldest prison in that house. One day, while I was folding clothes, and she came and sat beside me, she only said this: "Thinking too much is dangerous here." I looked at her. Was she warning me? Or praying for me? That was when I understood. This house wasn't just about one abusive man. This house was a pattern. And the second part of that pattern was my brother-in-law. He didn't look like his father. He was sharper than him, My father-in-law would explode, and then get tired. But my brother-in-law never got tired. He remembered people's reactions, who stayed quiet and when, who lowered their eyes and how. And most of all, he remembered me. One evening, when everyone was sitting at the dining table, he suddenly said, "You used to talk more." That wasn't casual. That was an announcement. I replied calmly, "I've started liking listening." For a second, silence took over the table. My father-in-law wanted to say something, then stopped. My brother-in-law simply nodded. That night, for the first time, I wasn't just afraid of this house. I was understanding it. Late at night, I sensed someone walking through the corridor repeatedly. The footsteps were light, but consistent. I locked the door. My heart was racing. It reminded me of my childhood. That same feeling of fear, when something is about to happen, but you don't know what. The next morning, I became even more normal, more polite, more calm, more fine. And that drove my father-in-law crazy and made my brother-in-law alert. Because when a woman suddenly appears, completely in control, questions arise in houses like this. I didn't say anything to anyone. No complaints. No accusations. Just observation. Who speaks to whom? Who stays silent in front of whom? Who avoids whose eyes? And slowly, it became clear to me that the father and son weren't fully comfortable, even with each other. There was only one thing holding them together: the fear of losing control. And I knew, if I shifted just one small thing in the right place, this entire house would start shaking from the inside. That night, I made a decision. I wouldn't fight by screaming. I wouldn't run away. I would use this house's rules against the house itself. Because when people stop feeling safe in their own home, falling becomes only a matter of time. Sometimes the most dangerous enemy is the one who believes you are weak. And the moment they believe that, your quietest planning begins. And then there comes a time when one small action shakes the balance of the entire house. It was morning, and I knew this day would be different. My father-in-law's mood was more aggressive than usual, but he didn't know that I was mentally prepared. And my brother-in-law, he was only observing. I knew this much. They cover each other's weaknesses, but for the first time, a small crack was visible between them. And I wanted to widen that crack. I followed my usual routine in the kitchen, made coffee, prepared breakfast. Everything looked normal. But that routine was only a disguise. When my father-in-law woke up and entered the kitchen, I noticed he wouldn't meet my eyes. He went straight to the coffee machine. I picked up my mug and executed my plan. It was a small thing. I made only a tiny cup of coffee for him and put the rest in the fridge. He came to drink his coffee, and the moment he saw it, he froze. "What is this, so little?" He spoke angrily, but I kept my face calm. I knew this was the first psychological hit. His ego was wounded, and my brother-in-law observed everything. For the first time, there was doubt and a slight tension in his eyes. I only smiled and made a casual comment. The coffee from last night was enough. He angrily knocked the cup over and walked out of the kitchen. And I stayed normal. But this was only the beginning. Throughout the day, I kept observing. My brother-in-law was watching me constantly. But he didn't say anything. Only silent warnings through his eyes. I understood that he was measuring my intelligence and patience. And my father-in-law, he reacted to the smallest things again and again. Coffee, utensils, minor delays. Everything was triggering his ego. In the evening, I spoke lightly to my mother-in-law. Keep tomorrow's dinner simple, so no one gets suspicious. She looked at me with her eyes, and I understood that she supported my planning. And I intended to use that. The next morning, this was the first major move of the plan. I went to the kitchen early and made a new recipe. Special tea, but with extra strong coffee and a slight mix of spices that would affect the body and nerves after drinking it. My father-in-law wouldn't understand what was happening, but he would become alert. And my brother-in-law, he would silently observe. When he woke up and came for tea, I casually asked, "How's your mood this morning?" He only stared. The taste of the tea showed on his face. For the first time, he noticed that something was wrong. And my brother-in-law, he was reading every move of mine through his eyes. I maintained a calm and confident look. And that confidence was my first real weapon. During the day, I observed the dynamics of the house. My father-in-law was irritated by small things. My brother-in-law sent signals with his eyes. "You're smart, but we're not weak." And my mother-in-law, she silently supported me with her gaze. I realized this house was a psychological battlefield. And I decided that the first strike would be silent, hidden, and precise. At night, I left a small light on near my father-in-law's room, forcing him to observe and think. And my brother-in-law would naturally notice it. I slightly shifted some kitchen utensils, as if something small was misplaced or missing. In the morning, my father-in-law was even more nervous. My brother-in-law noticed that something was unusual. He looked at me, casual, calm, smiling, but plotting. I had successfully executed the first psychological move. An ego hit plus uncertainty plus tension buildup. At night, I was sleeping but fully alert. I knew this first move was only a small signal for both of them. And the moment they started believing I was just a harmless daughter-in-law, the next move would emotionally and mentally confuse them both. And the most important rule of this house was this: when suspicion and tension enter a home, the first victim is always ego and control. Now I am only waiting and observing, understanding the meaning of every reaction, calculating the impact of every move. And this is only the beginning. Sometimes silence is not answered with silence. Sometimes the answer is a scream. And when years of anger explode all at once, it is no longer just revenge. It becomes justice. This time, I was not in the mood to stay quiet. I had endured enough. I had tolerated enough. And when a woman goes through mental torture every single day, one day her patience begins to speak for itself. It was morning. I was working in the kitchen when my brother-in-law walked in. The same old arrogance in his eyes. The same pride. He taunted me. "You think you're being very smart." I replied without stopping my work. "No, I think. I've just stopped staying silent." He laughed loudly. "You think you'll win in this house." And at that moment, my father-in-law entered. "What's going on here?" His voice, as always, was commanding. My brother-in-law immediately said, "This sister-in-law is trying to mess with us. Sometimes things are misplaced. Sometimes strange behavior." My father-in-law looked at me and shouted, "How dare you create drama in my house?" That was it. That was the moment when my silence broke. For the first time, I raised my voice in front of both of them. "Drama. Your daily taunts were the real drama. You're screaming. The kind you did when there were no men in the house. That was the drama." The entire kitchen went silent. My father-in-law turned red with anger. "Watch your language." I answered directly. "You watch your language. When the person in front of you speaks with respect." My brother-in-law jumped in. "You think you're the victim." I looked at him and said, "You think becoming like your father will make you a hero." He snapped, "You're crossing the line." And I finally said what had been trapped inside me for years. "The line was crossed the day you both assumed that fear would keep me silent forever." My father-in-law slammed his hand on the table. "This is my house," I shouted back, "and I am your daughter-in-law, not your enemy." My mother-in-law had arrived by then. There were tears in her eyes. For the first time, she looked at her husband and said, "Enough. You've turned this house into a battlefield." My father-in-law was stunned. He was not used to anyone standing against him. I saw the moment and delivered my final strike. I didn't take revenge because it gave me pleasure. I took revenge so you could understand that fear doesn't belong to just one side. My brother-in-law said angrily, "What can you even do?" I looked straight into his eyes and said, "I've already done what keeps both of you awake at night." There was no silence in the house. There was shock. My father-in-law's voice softened for the first time. "What do you want?" And I gave the strongest answer of my life. "Just peace." If that isn't possible, then a response. After that day, some things changed forever. My father-in-law stopped screaming. My brother-in-law started ignoring me. And I stood straight. A few weeks later, when we were leaving the house, my father-in-law said from behind, "You ruined the peace of this home." I turned and replied, "No, I only showed you a mirror." And this time, He stayed silent. And this is how the story ended. Not with silence alone, but with a voice with truth. And with a revenge that would be remembered for a lifetime.